Tyler Sanchez stood frozen in his doorway, watching Ethan Chavez pace across his living room like a caged animal. The late evening light cast long shadows through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, and Tyler could see the tension radiating from every line of Ethan's body. His best friend since college had been showing up unannounced for weeks now, always with that same desperate look in his eyes, always saying the same thing with increasing urgency and vulnerability. Quote. Tyler's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Ethan run his hands through his dark hair, the gesture so familiar it made Tyler's chest ache with a longing he was only beginning to understand. This was the moment everything would change between them. Tyler could feel it in the charged air, thick with unspoken words and suppressed desires, in the way Ethan's eyes kept finding his and holding just a beat too long, in the way his friend's voice cracked when he said Tyler's like it was a prayer. "Ethan," Tyler whispered, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him with deliberate slowness. "What's really going on? And please don't give me another excuse about work stress or Martha. I can see right through you." Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face him, and Tyler saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression that made his breath catch in his throat. His friend's usual confident demeanor had crumbled completely, leaving behind someone Tyler barely recognized but somehow knew better than anyone else in the world. The strong shoulders were slumped, the usually bright eyes were shadowed with uncertainty, and there was a tremor in his hands that Tyler had never seen before. Quote 3. Ethan started, then stopped, swallowing hard enough that Tyler could see his Adam's apple bob. "I think I'm falling in love with you." "No, that's not right. I think I've already fallen. I think I've been falling for months and just didn't know what to call it." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither was ready to cross but couldn't ignore. Tyler felt his world tilt on its axis, everything he thought he knew about himself and his friendship with Ethan reshaping in an instant, like looking at a familiar photograph and suddenly seeing details that had always been there but never noticed. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two straight best friends found themselves standing on the precipice of something neither had seen coming, we need to go back to where it all began. We need to understand the slow burn of realization, the gradual awakening of feelings that had been buried so deep neither man had recognized them for what they were. 3 months earlier, Tyler had been living what he thought was a perfectly normal life, structured and predictable in the way that made him feel secure. He worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown, creating logos and advertisements for local businesses with meticulous attention to detail. He had a decent apartment in the city, a one-bedroom place with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in plenty of natural light for his work. Most of his free time was spent hanging out with Ethan or playing video games, sometimes both simultaneously, when Ethan would bring his console over for marathon gaming sessions that lasted until the early hours of the morning. At 28, he figured he had life mostly figured out, even if his dating life had been a string of disappointing relationships with women who never quite seemed to get him. There was always something missing, some spark that never quite caught fire, some connection that felt forced rather than natural. He'd attributed it to bad luck, to not having met the right person yet, to the general difficulty of dating in the modern world. Ethan had been dating Martha Ward for almost 2 years, and Tyler had grown used to hearing about their relationship troubles during their weekly hangouts. Martha was nice enough, a kindergarten teacher with a sweet smile, and an organized life that seemed to complement Ethan's more chaotic energy. She was the kind of woman who kept her apartment spotless, who planned meals a week in advance, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries with thoughtful gifts. On paper, she was perfect for Ethan, but lately Ethan had been complaining more and more about feeling disconnected from her, about going through the motions of a relationship without feeling the deeper connection he craved. Quote 5. Ethan had said one Thursday night as they sat on Tyler's couch playing Call of Duty, their controllers clicking rapidly as they navigated through a particularly challenging level. "We have dinner, we watch TV, we go to bed, but there's no spark, no real connection. I feel like I'm playing a part in someone else's life." Tyler had nodded and made appropriate sympathetic noises, but part of him had been secretly relieved. Though he couldn't have explained why at the time. He'd never been able to put his finger on why, but something about Ethan and Martha together had always felt wrong to him. Not wrong in a judgmental way, just wrong in a way that made his stomach twist uncomfortably whenever he saw them together. Like watching actors in a play who had no chemistry but were trying to convince the audience they were in love. Maybe you just need to try harder, Tyler had suggested, though the words felt hollow even as he said them, like he was reading lines from a script he didn't believe in. But all, Ethan had given him a look that was part grateful, part frustrated, and entirely confused. Quit all, nine. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take some incredible turns that you won't want to miss. The journey Tyler and Ethan are about to embark on will challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and show us that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch us completely off guard. Tyler had laughed it off at the time, making a joke about being a great wingman and deflecting the compliment with self-deprecating humor. But the comment had stuck with him for days afterward, playing on repeat in his mind during quiet moments at work or when he was lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. He'd found himself analyzing it, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit anywhere he could see, but that he couldn't stop trying to place. The first time Ethan showed up without texting was on a Tuesday night in early March, when the last traces of winter were finally giving way to the promise of spring. Tyler had been working late on a particularly challenging logo design for a local coffee shop, trying to capture the perfect balance of modern and cozy, when he heard the familiar knock on his door. It wasn't the confident rap of someone who was expected, but the hesitant tap of someone who wasn't sure they should be there, but couldn't stay away. He'd opened it to find Ethan standing there with red-rimmed eyes and rumpled clothes, looking like he'd been walking the streets for hours without any particular destination in mind. Ethan had said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. Wish you 11 and quote hour, Tyler had replied immediately, stepping aside and noting the way Ethan's shoulders sagged with relief as he crossed the threshold. What happened? You look like hell, man. Seriously, when's the last time you slept? Ethan had collapsed onto the couch and buried his face in his hands, his whole body seeming to fold in on itself. Martha and I had another fight, a big one this time. She said I'm emotionally unavailable, that I never really open up to her, that she feels like she's dating a stranger who's just going through the motions. Tyler had sat down beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close that it would seem weird, though he'd noticed how natural it felt to want to reach out and touch Ethan's shoulder, to offer physical comfort along with emotional support. What did you say to that? Tyler had asked gently. That's the thing. Ethan had looked up at him with confusion written all over his face, his dark eyes searching Tyler's as if looking for answers Tyler wasn't sure he had. I couldn't argue with her because she's right. I don't open up to her. I don't share my real thoughts and feelings. But I don't understand why. I mean, I love her, right? We've been together for 2 years. I should be able to talk to her about anything. I should want to share my deepest thoughts with her. But you can't. No, I can't. And the weird thing is, I can talk to you about anything. I always have been able to. You know things about me that Martha doesn't even know I think about. So why can't I do that with the woman I'm supposed to marry? Why does opening up to you feel as natural as breathing, but opening up to her feels like pulling teeth? The question had hung between them, heavy with implications that Tyler hadn't been ready to examine. He'd mumbled something about relationships being complicated and made them both coffee, but Ethan's words had lodged themselves somewhere deep in his chest, taking root like seeds in fertile soil. That night, Ethan had fallen asleep on Tyler's couch, and Tyler had covered him with a blanket before heading to his own bed. But he'd lain awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, and then trying to understand why seeing Ethan vulnerable and seeking comfort from him had felt so right, so natural, when it should have just felt like normal friendship. There had been something about the weight of Ethan's trust, the way he'd sought out Tyler's presence when he was hurting, that had stirred something deep in Tyler's chest that he couldn't name. The unannounced visits became more frequent after that night, following no particular pattern that Tyler could discern. Sometimes Ethan would show up after fights with Martha, arriving with that same lost look and needing to talk through his confusion and frustration. Sometimes he'd arrive with takeout from their favorite restaurants and a movie suggestion, claiming he just wanted company, but staying until the early hours of the morning. And sometimes he'd just appear at Tyler's door with that lost look in his eyes and say, quote 20, as if Tyler's presence was something essential, like air or water. Tyler never minded these impromptu visits. In fact, he found himself looking forward to them more than he cared to admit, checking his phone more frequently in the evenings, and feeling disappointed on nights when Ethan didn't show up. There was something about having Ethan in his space, seeing him relaxed and unguarded, that filled a hollow place in Tyler's chest. He hadn't even realized existed until Ethan started filling it. During these visits, Tyler began to notice things about Ethan that he'd somehow missed in all their years of friendship. The way Ethan's eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed genuinely, not the polite laugh he used in social situations, but the real, unguarded laughter that came from deep in his chest. The way he gestured with his hands when he got excited about something, painting pictures in the air with graceful movements. The way he looked at Tyler when he thought Tyler wasn't paying attention, with an intensity that made Tyler's weak skin feel warm. It was during one of these visits, about a month after they'd started, that things began to shift in a way that Tyler couldn't ignore or rationalize away. They'd been watching a movie, some action thriller that neither of them was really paying attention to. The volume turned low as they talked over the dialogue. The evening had been comfortable and easy, the kind of relaxed intimacy that Tyler had come to associate with Ethan's presence. But as the night wore on, Tyler had become increasingly aware of the space between them on the couch, the way their knees almost touched, the way Ethan's arm was draped along the back of the sofa behind Tyler's shoulders. When Ethan had suddenly turned to him with a serious expression, Tyler had felt his heart rate pick up in anticipation of something significant. Quote 21, Ethan had said, his voice lower than usual, almost hesitant. Quote 22, Tyler had replied, muting the TV and giving Ethan his full attention. Quote 23, quote 20. The question hit Tyler like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and making his head spin. He felt heat rush to his face and was grateful for the dim lighting in the room that might hide his reaction. Quote 25, quote, Ethan had continued, seemingly oblivious to Tyler's shock, his own eyes fixed on his hands as he spoke. But I was thinking about what Martha said, about me being emotionally unavailable, and I started wondering if maybe there's something wrong with me. Like maybe I'm not wired the way I'm supposed to be. Maybe there's a reason I can't connect with her the way I should. Tyler's mouth had gone dry, his tongue feeling thick and useless. K28, quit to 29. It made perfect sense, more sense than Tyler was comfortable with. The description matched his own experiences with dating so precisely it was unsettling. He'd nodded slowly, not trusting his voice to remain steady. So I started thinking, Ethan had continued, finally looking up to meet Tyler's eyes. 31. The air in the room had felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm, when the atmosphere becomes heavy and electric. Tyler had found himself studying Ethan's profile in the flickering light from the TV, noticing things he'd never let himself notice before. The strong line of his gum shadowed with stubble that Tyler suddenly wanted to touch. The way his dark eyes seemed to hold flecks of gold when the light hit them just right. The fullness of his lips, which Tyler realized he'd been staring at for longer than was appropriate between friends. Tyler? Ethan had turned to look at him directly, and Tyler had felt caught, exposed, as if Ethan could see every inappropriate thought that had been running through his mind. You didn't answer my question. Which question? Tyler had managed, though he knew exactly which question Ethan meant. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss a guy? Tyler had felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that his answer would either send him tumbling into the unknown or pull him back to the safety of familiar ground. But looking into Ethan's eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the genuine curiosity and something that might have been hope, he'd found himself choosing the cliff without hesitation. Yeah, he'd whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. Good 7. Ethan's eyes had widened slightly, and Tyler had seen his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. Put their hand on the quarter. They had sat there for a long moment, the admission hanging between them like a secret neither knew what to do with. The movie continued playing in the background, forgotten as they stared at each other in the dim light. Then Ethan had reached out and touched Tyler's hand where it rested on the couch cushion between them. his fingers warm and slightly trembling. Tear him, Ethan had said quietly, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across Tyler's knuckles. Specifically, I've been thinking about what it would be like to kiss you. Tyler's heart had stopped, actually stopped. He was sure of it because the silence in his chest was deafening, a complete absence of sound that seemed to stretch for eternity. Then it had started again, hammering so hard he was certain Ethan could hear it across the small space between them. He'd started, but Ethan had shaken his head gently. I know it's crazy. I know it doesn't make sense, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you. About us. About what this feeling is that I get when I'm around you. The sense of rightness that I've never felt with anyone else. Tyler had stared at their joined hands, at the way Ethan's thumb was tracing gentle patterns across his knuckles, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. It was like a door opening in a room he hadn't even known existed, revealing a space that had always been there, but had been locked away from his conscious mind. What about Martha? He'd managed to ask, though the question felt distant and unimportant compared to the warmth of Ethan's touch. Ethan had been quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he considered the question. I think Martha and I both know our relationship is over. We're just too scared to admit it, too comfortable with the familiar to take the step into the unknown. But Tyler, what I feel when I'm with you, it's not fear. It's the opposite of fear. What is it? It's like coming home. It's like finding a part of myself I didn't know was missing. That night, Ethan had stayed over again, but this time Tyler had offered him the guest room instead of the couch. They'd said goodnight in the hallway, standing closer than friends usually stood, and Tyler had felt the urge to reach out and touch Ethan's face, to trace the line of his cheekbone with his thumb and see if his skin was as warm as it looked. He hadn't done it, but he'd wanted to with an intensity that had surprised him. And from the way Ethan had lingered in the doorway, looking at Tyler with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through him, Tyler thought maybe Ethan had wanted him to. The next morning had been awkward in the way that mornings after emotional revelations always are. They'd had coffee and made small talk about work and the weather, both of them carefully avoiding the topic of what had been said the night before. But there had been a new awareness between them, a current of possibility that hadn't been there before, crackling in the space between their casual touches and lingering glances. Over the following weeks, the tension between them had grown like a living thing, feeding on every shared glance and accidental touch. Ethan continued to show up unannounced, but now his visits felt charged with unspoken questions and barely contained desire. They would sit closer together on the couch, their shoulders touching, their knee bumping in a way that sent electricity shooting through Tyler's nervous system. Ethan would find excuses to touch Tyler, a hand on his shoulder when he laughed, fingers brushing when they passed each other coffee cups, casual contact that felt anything but casual. Tyler found himself cataloging these moments, storing them away like precious treasures to be examined later in the privacy of his own thoughts. The way Ethan's eyes would darken when their gazes met and held for a beat too long. The way his friend's voice would drop to a whisper when they talked late into the night, creating an intimate bubble around them that felt separate from the rest of the world. The way Ethan would look at Tyler's mouth when he thought Tyler wasn't paying attention, his gaze lingering on Tyler's lips with an intensity that made Tyler's skin feel tight and warm. It was during one of these charged evenings that Martha finally ended things with Ethan. Tyler had been in his kitchen making dinner, humming along to music playing from his phone as he stirred a pot of pasta sauce, when Ethan had burst through the front door without bothering to knock, his spare key jingling in his hand. Ethan had announced without preamble, but instead of looking devastated as Tyler would have expected, he'd looked almost relieved, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Tyler had turned from the stove, spatula still in hand, sauce dripping onto the floor unnoticed. What happened? Are you okay? She said she was tired of competing with someone else for my attention, Ethan had said, leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed. She said it was obvious my heart was somewhere else, that I was just going through the motions with her. Did you tell her she was wrong? Tyler had asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Ethan had met his eyes across the small kitchen, his gaze steady and unflinching. No, because she wasn't wrong. My heart is somewhere else. It's been somewhere else for a long time. I just didn't want to admit it. The spatula had slipped from Tyler's fingers, clattering onto the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Neither of them had moved to pick it up, too focused on each other to care about the mess. Quote 54. Quote Item. Tyler had felt his knees go weak, his hand reaching out to grip the edge of the counter for support. Quote Item. Tyler had stood frozen, his mind reeling as he tried to process what Ethan was saying. This was Ethan, his best friend since college, the guy who'd dated women exclusively for as long as Tyler had known him. This was the same Ethan who'd spent 2 years with Martha, who talked about marriage and kids and a white picket fence future with casual certainty. But looking at him now, seeing the raw honesty in his expression, Tyler realized that this was also the Ethan who'd been showing up at his door for weeks, saying he needed Tyler. This was the Ethan who'd asked about kissing guys, who'd admitted to thinking about kissing Tyler specifically. This was the Ethan who'd said being with Tyler felt like coming home. I'm scared, Tyler had whispered, the admission slipping out before he could stop it. Me too, Ethan had replied, stepping closer, close enough that Tyler could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. But Tyler, I'm more scared of not trying. I'm more scared of walking away from this and spending the rest of my life wondering what if. They'd stood there in the kitchen, the smell of burning dinner filling the air around them, and Tyler had felt like he was standing at the edge of his old life, looking across at something entirely new and terrifying and wonderful. Sebastiano. Tyler had said, his voice barely audible. Quote saw and quote wow and quote I've done. Ethan had smiled then, the first real smile Tyler had seen from him in weeks, bright and genuine and full of hope. Quote Tampano. That night, they'd ordered pizza after Tyler had turned off the burnt dinner, and they'd talked until sunrise about everything and nothing. They'd talked about their friendship and their fears, about what it might mean if they crossed this line they'd been dancing around for weeks. They'd talked about identity and sexuality and the terrifying prospect of redefining everything they thought they knew about themselves. What if we try this and it ruins everything? Tyler had asked as they sat on his couch in the pre-dawn light, their pizza boxes empty and forgotten on the coffee table. What if we don't try it and we spend the rest of our lives wondering? Ethan had countered. Tyler, you're my best friend. You're the person I trust most in the world. If I'm going to figure out who I really am, I want to figure it out with you. Even if it's messy, even if we don't know what we're doing? Especially then, because Tyler, the best things in life are usually messy and complicated and scary. And what I feel for you, it's all of those things, but it's also the most real thing I've ever experienced. The first time Ethan kissed him was 3 days later, on a Friday evening that had started like any other, but would end up changing everything between them. Tyler had been having a particularly stressful day at work, dealing with a difficult client who kept changing their mind about every aspect of a logo design, demanding revision after revision without being able to articulate what they actually wanted. He'd come home exhausted and frustrated, his shoulders tight with tension, wanting nothing more than a beer and mindless television to help him decompress. But when he'd turned the corner onto his street, he'd seen Ethan sitting on the steps outside his apartment building with takeout bags from their favorite Thai place, looking like he'd been waiting for a while. The sight of him there, patient and reliable, and somehow knowing exactly what Tyler needed, had made Tyler's chest tighten with an emotion he was still learning to name. Quote 71. Ethan had asked, taking in Tyler's expression with the kind of careful attention that Tyler had come to associate with Ethan's presence in his life. Quote 72. Tyler had replied, but already he'd felt some of the tension leaving his shoulders just from seeing Ethan there. There was something about Ethan's presence that had always been able to calm him, even before things between them had gotten complicated. Ethan had said simply, standing up and brushing off his jeans. Quote 75. They'd eaten dinner on Tyler's couch, Ethan regaling him with stories from his own workday to distract him from his stress. Tyler had found himself watching Ethan's mouth as he talked, noticing the way his lips curved when he smiled, the way his tongue darted out to catch a drop of sauce, the way he unconsciously licked his lips when he was thinking about what to say next. Tyler, Ethan had said suddenly, and Tyler had realized he'd been staring again. caught in the act of studying Ethan's mouth with obvious interest. Sorry, I was just... Tyler had started, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. Just what? Tyler had felt heat rise in his cheeks, but something about the gentle curiosity in Ethan's voice had made him brave. Quote 79. Ethan had set down his container of pad thai and turned to face Tyler fully, giving him the kind of complete attention that made Tyler feel like he was the only person in the world. The air between them had charged instantly, like electricity building before a storm. Ethan had reached out and cupped Tyler's face with one hand, his palm warm and slightly rough against Tyler's skin, his thumb brushing across Tyler's cheekbone with infinite gentleness. Do you want to find out? Ethan had whispered, his voice rough with desire and nervousness. Tyler had nodded, not trusting his voice, his heart hammering so hard he was sure Ethan could feel it through his skin. Ethan had leaned in slowly, giving Tyler time to pull away if he wanted to. But Tyler hadn't wanted to pull away. He'd wanted this more than he'd ever wanted anything in his life, wanted it with an intensity that scared and thrilled him in equal measure. When their lips had finally met, it had been soft and tentative at first, just a gentle pressure that sent shockwaves through Tyler's entire body. Then Ethan had deepened the kiss, and Tyler had felt something inside him crack open like an egg, releasing feelings he hadn't even known he'd been holding back. It had been nothing like kissing women. It had been rougher, more urgent, but also somehow more tender. Ethan's stubble had scratched against Tyler's skin in a way that was foreign but not unpleasant, and his hands had been larger and stronger as they'd tangled in Tyler's hair. But more than the physical differences, there had been an emotional intensity to it that had taken Tyler's breath away, a sense of rightness that he'd never felt before. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Tyler had felt like he'd been turned inside out, like every nerve ending in his body had been rewired. Wow, Ethan had whispered, resting his forehead against Tyler's, his breath warm against Tyler's skin. Yeah, Tyler had agreed, because wow was really the only word that fit. That was different. Good different? Tyler had looked into Ethan's eyes, seeing his own wonder and confusion reflected there, along with something deeper and more profound that made his chest tight with emotion. They'd kissed again after that, longer and deeper, and Tyler had felt like he was discovering a part of himself he'd never known existed. When Ethan's hands had slipped under his shirt, tracing patterns on his skin that left trails of fire in their wake, Tyler had made a sound he had never made before, something between a gasp and a moan that had made Ethan pull back to look at him with dark, heated eyes. Bud 89, Ethan had said, his voice rough with desire and concern. Tyler had replied, his voice coming out more breathless than he'd intended. I don't want to stop. I never want to stop. And then he'd been the one leaning in for the next kiss, surprising himself with his boldness. That night, they'd made out on Tyler's couch like teenagers, exploring this new dynamic between them with careful hands and hungry mouths. They hadn't gone further than kissing and touching over clothes. But it had been more intense than anything Tyler had ever experienced. Every touch had felt electric. Every kiss had felt like a revelation. And when Ethan had finally gone home around midnight, Tyler had felt like his entire world had shifted on its axis. He'd lain in bed replaying every moment, every touch, every sound Ethan had made when Tyler had kissed his neck. He'd felt like his entire world had shifted, like he'd been living his life in black and white, and suddenly everything was in vivid, overwhelming color. The next few weeks had been a whirlwind of discovery and confusion, a roller coaster of emotions that left Tyler feeling exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. Ethan continued to show up at Tyler's apartment, but now their time together was charged with sexual tension and the memory of that first kiss. They would start out watching a movie or talking about their days, maintaining the pretense of normal friendship, but inevitably they would end up kissing, hands roaming and breath coming short, losing themselves in the electric connection between them. Tyler had never considered himself particularly sexual before, had never been the type to think about physical intimacy constantly or to feel overwhelmed by desire. But with Ethan, he felt like he was constantly on fire, like every nerve ending in his body had been awakened to possibilities he'd never imagined. Every touch, every look, Every whispered word sent electricity shooting through his veins, and he found himself thinking about Ethan constantly, replaying their kisses and imagining what it would be like to go further. But along with the desire came confusion and fear that threatened to overwhelm him during quiet moments. Tyler had never questioned his sexuality before, had never even considered the possibility that he might be attracted to men. The fact that he was not just attracted to but seemingly falling in love with his best friend was overwhelming, like trying to solve a puzzle when half the pieces had suddenly changed shape. Quote 93. He'd confessed to Ethan one night as they lay tangled together on his couch, Ethan's head on his chest and their legs intertwined. Quote 94, quote no. Ethan had asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Tyler's chest that made it hard to concentrate on forming coherent thoughts. I mean, I've had girlfriends, I've had sex with women, but it never felt like this. It never felt like my skin was on fire just from someone touching me. I never felt like I might die if someone stopped kissing me. Ethan had propped himself up on his elbow to look down at Tyler, his dark eyes serious and understanding. Maybe you were just with the wrong people. Or maybe I was the wrong gender, Tyler had said, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him for days. Tyler, there's no wrong gender. There's just what feels right for you. And what feels right can change or evolve or be different than what you expected. Does this feel right for you? Tyler had asked, gesturing between them with a vulnerability that made his voice shake. This feels more right than anything I've ever experienced in my life, Ethan had replied without hesitation, his voice firm with conviction. Tyler, I know this is scary and confusing. It's scary and confusing for me too, but I've never felt as much like myself as I do when I'm with you like this. Tyler had pulled Ethan down for a kiss then, pouring all of his confusion and desire and growing love into the contact. When they'd broken apart, both breathing hard, Tyler had made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He'd said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him, I want to see where this goes, even if I don't understand it yet. Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured. I don't want you to do anything you're not ready for. I'm sure that I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you. And I'm sure that whatever's happening between us, it's worth exploring, even if it's scary. You're not going to lose me, Ethan had promised, pressing soft kisses to Tyler's jaw that made him shiver. Quote 108. But Tyler's fears hadn't been entirely unfounded. As their physical relationship had deepened, so had the complexity of their situation. They were navigating uncharted territory, figuring out not just their attraction to each other, but their own identities in the process. And it was messy and complicated and sometimes overwhelming. Tyler found himself questioning everything he'd thought he knew about himself, lying awake at night and running through his past relationships, looking for signs he might have missed. Was he gay? Bisexual? Had he always been attracted to men and just not realized it? Had he been living in denial his entire adult life? The questions swirled in his head constantly, making him feel unmoored and uncertain about the most basic aspects of his identity. Ethan seemed to be handling the transition better, but Tyler suspected that was because Ethan had always been more comfortable with uncertainty, more willing to embrace change and see where it led. Where Tyler needed labels and definitions to feel secure, Ethan was content to just experience and see what developed. Does it matter what we call it? Ethan had asked one evening when Tyler was spiraling about labels, pacing around his apartment and running his hands through his hair in frustration. Does it matter if you're gay or bi or something else entirely? What matters is how we feel about each other. It matters to me, Tyler had replied, stopping his pacing to face Ethan. I need to understand what's happening to me. I need to know who I am. What's happening to you is that you're falling in love, Ethan had said simply, standing up and crossing to Tyler, taking his hands to still their nervous movement. Everything else is just details. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday night in late April, when the spring air was thick with humidity and the promise of storms. Tyler had been having a particularly difficult week, struggling with a major project at work that seemed to grow more complicated with each revision, and dealing with some family drama involving his parents' ongoing disagreement about whether to sell their childhood home. He'd been looking forward to a quiet night at home, maybe ordering pizza, and watching something mindless on Netflix to help his brain decompress from the constant stress. But when he'd gotten home, still dripping from the rain and feeling emotionally drained, he'd found Ethan sitting on his couch, looking more serious than Tyler had seen him in weeks. There was something in Ethan's posture, in the way he was sitting forward with his hands clasped, that immediately put Tyler on alert. Ethan had said, and Tyler's stomach had dropped like a stone. "That sounds ominous," Tyler had replied, trying to keep his tone light even as panic started to rise in his chest, his mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. "It's not ominous, it's just important. Really important." Tyler had sat down beside Ethan, but not as close as he usually did. Something about Ethan's tone had made him cautious, unsure of what was coming, but certain it would change things between them. Quote 1A to I thought Tyler had asked, his voice carefully neutral. Quote 100 Ethan had started, his words measured and careful. Quote 20, quote 20 and quote man. Tyler had felt his heart start to race, anticipation and fear warring in his chest. Quote good twarm. Ethan had said simply, the word hanging in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Quote 20. The words had hit Tyler like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and making the room spin slightly around him. He'd known, on some level, that their feelings had moved beyond friendship and attraction. But hearing Ethan say it out loud, hearing him use the word love with such conviction, had made it real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Ethan," Tyler had started, but Ethan had held up a hand, his expression determined. "Let me finish. I know this is complicated. I know we're both still figuring out what this means for our identities, for our futures. But I can't keep pretending that this is just casual for me. I can't keep kissing you and touching you and falling asleep in your arms without acknowledging that I want more than that. What do you want? I want everything. I want to date you, really date you. I want to hold your hand in public and introduce you as my boyfriend and wake up next to you every morning. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like." Tyler had stared at Ethan, his mind reeling as he tried to process the magnitude of what was being offered. This was everything he'd been afraid to hope for and everything he'd been terrified of wanting. "Tyler, I need to know where you stand," Ethan had continued, his voice becoming more vulnerable with each word. "Because if this is just experimentation for you, if you're just trying to figure yourself out, and I'm a convenient way to do that, I need to know now. I can't keep falling deeper if there's no chance of you catching me." Tyler had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the vulnerability in Ethan's voice, the fear barely concealed beneath his words. The idea that Ethan thought he might be just an experiment, just a stepping stone to self-discovery, broke something open in Tyler's chest. "You think I'm using you?" Tyler had asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I think you're confused. And I think maybe you're confusing love for me with curiosity about men in general. I think maybe I'm just the safe way for you to explore this side of yourself." "Ethan, look at me." Ethan had met his eyes, and Tyler had seen all of his fears reflected there. Fear of rejection, fear of being a stepping stone, fear of having his heart broken by the person he trusted most in the world. "I am confused," Tyler had admitted, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "I'm confused about a lot of things. I'm confused about my sexuality and what this means for my identity and how to navigate being with a man when I've never done that before. But Ethan, I am not confused about how I feel about you. How do you feel about me?" Tyler had taken a deep breath, knowing that what he said next would change everything between them, for better or worse. "I feel like you're the missing piece I didn't even know I was looking for. I feel like everything in my life before you was just practice for loving you. I feel like when I'm with you, I'm the person I was always supposed to be." Ethan's eyes had widened, hope beginning to bloom in his expression, like flowers after rain. Quote 139. Tyler had continued, the words feeling both foreign and natural on his tongue. Quote one and quote one. Quote while Ethan had launched himself across the couch then, capturing Tyler's mouth in a kiss that was desperate and relieved and full of love. Tyler had kissed him back with everything he had, pouring months of confusion and desire and growing certainty into the contact, tasting salt from tears he wasn't sure belonged to him or Ethan. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard and slightly dazed, Ethan had rested his forehead against Tyler's. Ethan had whispered, his voice full of wonder. "Hotobehinid." Tyler had replied, his hands cupping Ethan's face. "It means we stop being scared of what this is and start being excited about what it could become." "I want to be your boyfriend," Ethan had said, the words coming out in a rush. "Officially, I want us to be together, really together." "I want that too," Tyler had said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I want all of it, the good parts and the scary parts and everything in between." That night had marked the real beginning of their relationship, the moment they stopped dancing around their feelings and committed to exploring them together. They talked until sunrise again, but this time the conversation had been about their future rather than their fears. They talked about coming out to their friends and families, about navigating the world as a same-sex couple, about what they wanted their life together to look like. It hadn't been easy. Coming out had been a process for both of them, complicated by the fact that they were coming out not just as gay or bisexual, but as being in love with each other. Some of their friends had been supportive, others had been confused, and a few had been less than accepting. Tyler had lost a couple of friendships over it, people who couldn't understand how he could suddenly be gay, who accused him of lying to himself or going through a phase. Tyler's parents had struggled with the news, not because they were homophobic, but because they'd never seen any signs that Tyler was anything other than straight. His mother had cried when he'd told them over dinner, not from disappointment, but from worry that Tyler was making his life unnecessarily difficult. Chipfano, she'd asked, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "It's just so sudden. You've never shown any interest in men before." "I'm sure, Mom," Tyler had replied, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I know it seems sudden from the outside, but it doesn't feel sudden to me. It feels like something I've been moving toward my whole life without realizing it." His father had been quiet for a long time before finally speaking, his voice gruff with emotion. "If Ethan makes you happy, then I'm happy for you. That's all that matters to your mother and me." Ethan's family had been more immediately accepting, perhaps because they'd always known Ethan was a little different, a little more sensitive and emotional than the typical straight guy stereotype. His sister had actually laughed when he'd told her, reaching over to punch his shoulder affectionately. She'd said with a grin, "You've been talking about Tyler non-stop for years. I was starting to think you were never going to put two and two together." But the most important thing was that they'd figured it out together. They'd navigated the confusion and fear and uncertainty as a team, supporting each other through the difficult moments and celebrating the victories together. When Tyler had his first panic attack about what coming out meant for his career, Ethan had held him through it, reminding him that his worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions. When Ethan had struggled with telling his conservative grandparents, Tyler had helped him practice the conversation until he felt confident. 6 months after that first kiss, they'd moved in together, combining their belongings and their lives in Tyler's apartment. Tyler had been nervous about the transition, worried that living together might change the dynamic between them or reveal incompatibilities they hadn't noticed during their courtship phase. But if anything, it had made their relationship stronger. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, sharing cooking duties and household chores, learning each other's habits and quirks in the intimate way that only comes from sharing space. Tyler had discovered that Ethan sang in the shower, that he left coffee cups all over the apartment like a trail of breadcrumbs, and that he had a habit of stealing Tyler's hoodies and wearing them around the house until they smelled like his cologne. Ethan had learned that Tyler was grumpy in the mornings until he'd had his first cup of coffee, that he organized his books by color rather than author, and that he talked to himself when he was working on difficult design projects, having entire conversations with his computer screen. They'd had their first real fight 3 months after moving in together, a stupid argument about whose turn it was to do the dishes that had escalated into a shouting match about deeper issues. Tyler had accused Ethan of not taking their domestic responsibilities seriously, and Ethan had accused Tyler of being controlling and rigid in his expectations. "You can't just leave your dishes everywhere and expect me to clean up after you," Tyler had shouted, his frustration boiling over after a week of coming home to find the kitchen a mess. "And you can't micromanage every aspect of our lives," Ethan had shot back. "Not everything has to be done your way all the time." They'd both stormed off to separate rooms, Tyler to his home office and Ethan to the bedroom, and Tyler had spent an hour convinced that this was it, that they'd finally hit the wall that would break them. He'd sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen without seeing it, wondering if they'd been naive to think they could make this work. But then Ethan had appeared in the doorway of Tyler's home office, looking sheepish and holding 2 cups of coffee prepared exactly the way Tyler liked it. Quote 116, Ethan had said, setting 1 cup down on Tyler's tray. You're right about the dishes. And you're not controlling, you just like things organized. I should respect that. I'm sorry too, Tyler had replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. I shouldn't have yelled at you, and I shouldn't have said you don't care about our home. I know you do. They'd talked through the fight, addressing the underlying issues and figuring out better ways to communicate their needs. It had been their first real test as a couple, and they'd passed it by choosing to work together rather than against each other. The night that brought them full circle, the night Tyler had opened his door to find Ethan pacing his living room with nervous energy, had come almost exactly 1 year after their first kiss. They'd been living together for 6 months, had been officially a couple for almost a year, but that night Ethan had seemed more nervous than Tyler had seen him since the early days of their relationship. Tyler had come home from work to find candles lit throughout the apartment and the smell of his favorite dinner wafting from the kitchen. Ethan had cooked for him before, but this felt different, more intentional, like a celebration or a special occasion Tyler had somehow forgotten. Bridge 64. Tyler had asked, setting down his bag and taking in the romantic atmosphere. Quote 1651, Ethan had replied, but there had been something in his voice, a nervous energy that had put Tyler on alert. They'd eaten dinner together, talking about their days and sharing stories from work. But Tyler had noticed that Ethan seemed distracted, checking his watch frequently and seeming to struggle to focus on the conversation. After dinner, when Tyler had offered to help with the dishes, Ethan had waved him away. Go relax in the living room, Ethan had said. I'll take care of this. Tyler had settled onto the couch with a glass of wine, but he'd found it hard to relax with Ethan's nervous energy filling the apartment. When Ethan had finally joined him, he'd immediately started pacing, running his hands through his hair, in the gesture Tyler had come to recognize as a sign of deep anxiety. Quote was Tyler had asked, watching Ethan pace. Quote was second on, quote women, Ethan had said, stopping to face him. Quote warning. Tyler's stomach had dropped, his mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. In his experience, conversations that started with, I've been thinking about us, rarely ended well. Okay, Tyler had said carefully, setting down his wine glass. What have you been thinking? I've been thinking about how much my life has changed in the past year. How much I've changed. A year ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. I was dating Martha, planning a conventional future, following the path that everyone expected me to follow. And now? Now I know that path was never right for me. Now I know that I was just going through the motions, playing a part that never fit. Tyler, you didn't just change my sexuality. You changed everything. You made me realize who I really am. Tyler had felt some of his tension ease, but he was still confused about where this conversation was going and why Ethan seemed so nervous about expressing what sounded like positive feelings. I'm glad, Tyler had said. But Ethan, why do you seem so nervous about this? This all sounds like good things. Because I want to ask you something and I'm terrified you're going to say no. Tyler's heart had started racing again, his mind spinning through possibilities. Watch out, show. Ethan had taken a deep breath, his hands visibly shaking as he reached into his pocket. Then he dropped to one knee right there in Tyler's living room, and Tyler had felt his knees go weak as Ethan pulled out a small velvet box. Ethan had said, his voice shaking slightly, but filled with determination. Quote, Tyler had stared down at Ethan, at the ring box in his hands, at the hope and fear and love shining in his eyes. A year ago, if someone had told Tyler that his straight best friend would be proposing to him in his living room, he would have laughed and suggested they seek professional help. But now, looking at Ethan on his knees, Tyler couldn't imagine any other ending to their story. Yes, Tyler had whispered, then louder, his voice breaking with emotion. Yes, of course, yes. 1,000 times yes. Ethan had slipped the ring onto Tyler's finger with shaking hands, a simple white gold band that caught the candlelight beautifully, then stood up to kiss him with tears streaming down both of their faces. It had been a kiss full of promise and joy, in the certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. Ethan had whispered against Tyler's lips, his voice rough with emotion. I love you too, Tyler had replied, his own voice thick with tears. I love you so much, it still scares me sometimes. Good scared or bad scared? Good scared. The kind of scared that means something matters more than anything else in the world. They'd called their families that night, sharing the news of their engagement with tears and laughter and overwhelming joy. Tyler's mother had cried again when they'd video called to show her the ring, but this time from happiness, her face glowing with pride and love. Then she'd said, pressing her hand to her chest, I'm so happy for you both. Ethan, welcome to the family officially. His father had asked to speak to Ethan privately, and Tyler had watched nervously as they'd talked in low voices for several minutes. When Ethan had handed the phone back, his eyes had been bright with unshed tears. Tyler had asked. Ethan had replied, his voice thick with emotion. Achambero. Ethan's family had been over the moon, his sister immediately starting to plan an engagement party, and his mother asking about wedding dates and venues with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for years. Quote 196 on them. Tyler had asked as they lay in bed that night, Tyler's new ring catching the light from the bedside lamp as he held up his hand to admire it. Tomorrow, Ethan had replied immediately, pulling Tyler closer. But I suppose we should probably plan something a little more elaborate than a courthouse wedding. Why tomorrow? Because I've already waited 29 years to find you. I don't want to wait any longer than I have to make you my husband. Tyler had rolled over to face Ethan, studying his features in the dim light, memorizing the way he looked in this moment of perfect happiness. You know, a year ago, I thought I had my life figured out. I thought I knew who I was and what I wanted. And now? Now I know I didn't know anything. But Ethan, I'm not scared of not knowing anymore. Because whatever I don't know, we'll figure out together. Together, Ethan had agreed, pulling Tyler closer until there was no space left between them. They'd planned their wedding for the following spring, a small ceremony in Tyler's parents' backyard with just their immediate families and closest friends. Tyler's mother had insisted on hiring a wedding planner, and what had started as a simple backyard gathering had evolved into something more elaborate but still intimate, with fairy lights strung through the trees and flowers everywhere. It had been perfect in its simplicity, a celebration of love that had grown from friendship into something neither of them had expected, but both had embraced completely. Tyler's best man had been his brother, and Ethan's had been his college roommate, but they'd written their own vows, promising to continue growing and changing together, to support each other through whatever discoveries lay ahead. Quote 5. Tyler had said during his vows, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered friends and family. Quote 26. Quote 27. Ethan had said during his vows, his eyes never leaving Tyler's face. It's being afraid and choosing love anyway. It's being willing to let go of who you thought you were supposed to be in order to become who you really are. After the ceremony, as they danced to their first song as husbands under the stars, Tyler had thought about all the moments that had led them to this one. The late-night conversations, the confused questions, the first tentative kiss, the fights and reconciliations and gradual building of something neither had planned, but both had chosen. Ethan had whispered in his ear as they swayed together, the music soft and romantic around them. Quote, Tyler had replied. Quote, Ethan had laughed, the sound warm and rich and full of joy. Quote, Tyler had pulled back to look at his husband's face, seeing the contentment there, the deep satisfaction of someone who had found exactly what they'd been looking for without even knowing they'd been searching. I love you, Ethan Chavez Sanchez, Tyler had said, using Ethan's new hyphenated name for the first time. Quote 215, Ethan had replied, and Tyler had felt a thrill at hearing his own new name. 2 years later, they were still discovering new things about themselves and each other, their relationship continuing to evolve and deepen in ways that surprised them both. Tyler had started his own design company, with Ethan handling the business side of things, and they discovered they worked together as well as they lived together. They'd bought a house in the suburbs, complete with a garden that Ethan tended with surprising skill, and a home office where Tyler could work on his designs without the distractions of client meetings and office politics. They'd faced challenges, of course. Coming out later in life had meant navigating some difficult conversations and losing some people they thought were friends. But it had also meant gaining a deeper understanding of themselves and each other, and a community of people who understood their journey in ways their straight friends couldn't. Tyler had joined a support group for men who'd come out later in life and had been amazed to discover how common his experience was. There were dozens of men who'd spent years thinking they were straight, only to discover that they'd been looking for love in the wrong places, trying to force themselves into shapes that had never fit. Quote, Tyler had shared during one of the group sessions, sitting in the circle of folding chairs in the community center. Quote, this room had laughed, a sound of recognition and understanding that had made Tyler feel less alone in his journey. Hearing other men share similar stories had helped him understand that his experience wasn't unusual or shameful, just different from what society had taught him to expect. Ethan had struggled more with the labels, never quite comfortable with calling himself gay or bisexual or any of the other terms people suggested. I'm Tyler sexual, he'd joke when people asked about his orientation. But privately, he'd told Tyler that he thought he might have always been gay, just deeply in denial about it. Looking back, I can see the signs, he'd said one night as they'd cuddled on their couch in their new house. I just wasn't ready to see them at the time. Does it matter now? Tyler had asked. Not really. What matters is that I found you. What matters is that we're happy. And they were happy, deeply, genuinely, surprisingly happy, in a way that felt both natural and miraculous. They'd built a life together that felt authentic and right, full of inside jokes and shared responsibilities and the kind of comfortable intimacy that comes from really knowing someone. They'd developed their own traditions and rhythms, from Sunday morning pancakes to Friday night movie marathons, to the way they said goodnight to each other every evening. They'd talked about having kids, maybe adopting or using a surrogate, and had started the preliminary research into what that process might look like. They'd talked about traveling, about the places they wanted to see together, and had already taken several trips that had deepened their bond and created new shared memories. They talked about growing old together, about what they wanted their legacy to be, about the kind of life they wanted to build in their little house with its garden and home office. But mostly they just lived. They woke up together and made coffee together and complained about work and celebrated small victories. They had friends over for dinner and went to movies and argued about what to watch on Netflix. They supported each other through difficult days and celebrated each other's successes and built something beautiful and ordinary and extraordinary all at once. It was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, this life they'd built from the ashes of their old assumptions about themselves. On their third wedding anniversary, they'd gone back to Tyler's old apartment, the place where their relationship had really begun. The current tenant had been happy to let them visit, amused by their story and touched by their obvious love for each other. She'd invited them in for coffee and listened with delight as they'd told her about their first kiss on the very couch where she now watched television every evening. They'd stood in the living room where they'd had their first real conversation about attraction, where they'd shared their first kiss, where Ethan had proposed. The space looked different with someone else's furniture and decorations, but Tyler could still feel the echoes of all the important moments that had happened within these walls. Tyler had said, looking around the space that had once felt like the center of his world. Quote, Ethan had replied, slipping his arm around Tyler's waist. Maybe we take up more space because we're more ourselves. Tyler had thought about that, about how much they'd both grown and changed since those early days of confusion and discovery. They were more confident now, more comfortable in their own skin and in their relationship. They'd learned how to fight and make up, how to support each other through difficult times, how to celebrate the good moments without taking them for granted. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't started showing up here? Tyler had asked. No, Ethan had said immediately, because I think I would have found some other excuse to be close to you. I think my heart knew what it wanted before my brain figured it out. You think we were inevitable? I think love always finds a way. Maybe not always the way we expect. Maybe not always when we're ready for it. But if it's real, if it's right, it finds a way. Tyler had reached for Ethan's hand, their wedding rings clicking together softly, a sound that had become as familiar and comforting as a heartbeat. What's about dawn? Ethan had said, bringing Tyler's hand to his lips to press a soft kiss to his knuckles. I'm glad we were brave enough to let it. As they'd walked back to their car, Tyler had thought about all the people who might be where they'd been 3 years ago. People who were confused about their sexuality, people who were in love with their best friends, people who were afraid to question the assumptions they'd made about themselves. He'd thought about all the Tylers and Ethans out there, standing at the edge of their own cliffs, afraid to jump, but more afraid of staying where they were. He'd thought about the Tyler who'd opened his door to find Ethan pacing his living room, terrified and hopeful and on the verge of the most important discovery of his life. That Tyler had been scared, but he'd been brave enough to take the leap anyway, to trust in something he didn't understand but couldn't deny. Quote 237. Tyler had said as they'd driven home through the city streets, past all the places that had been part of their journey. Yeah, thank you for showing up, for keeping showing up, even when neither of us knew what it meant. Thank you for letting me in, for being brave enough to let us figure it out together. Tyler had smiled, watching the familiar streets pass by outside the window, thinking about how different his life looked now compared to 3 years ago. Somewhere out there, he knew, there were other people standing at the edge of their own cliffs, afraid to jump, but more afraid of staying where they were. He hoped they would be brave enough to leap. He hoped they would find what he and Ethan had found, not just love, but the courage to become who they really were, the strength to question everything they thought they knew about themselves, the wisdom to trust in something bigger than their fears. And he hoped that when they did, they would have someone like Ethan to figure it out with. Someone who would show up without texting, who would say they just needed them, who would be brave enough to question everything for the chance at something real. Because that, Tyler had learned, was what love really was. Not just attraction or compatibility or shared interests, though those things mattered too. Love was showing up. Love was being brave enough to be vulnerable. Love was choosing each other, again and again, even when the choice was scary, even when it meant redefining everything you thought you knew about yourself. Love was Ethan Chavez pacing in his living room, saying he just needed Tyler, and Tyler being brave enough to ask what that really meant. And now, 3 years later, Tyler knew exactly what it meant. It meant everything. It meant home. It meant forever. It meant that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, the ones that make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself, the ones that require you to be braver than you ever imagined you could be. Tyler and Ethan had found that kind of love, and they were never letting it go.